Alright, so I'm on Photoshop right now and I made a model of this house on Rhino. And this is what that model looks like. I just made it right now in a few minutes, and I'm not going to include how I made it in this video. And what the exercise is going to be is that I'm going to take this house and I'm going to render it on Photoshop using only one material. And that material is going to be this piece of corroded copper that I just brought in. The corrosion is not appealing to most people, but there's some beauty in it that I see. So I want to try to render the whole entire scene using this one material here. And let's see what that looks like. So first, let's make the sky. We're gonna put this right under the model, the money shot as I called it. And let's put these together and we'll call them subject. That way this appears behind it now. We're gonna Control A and Control C. That copies the copper back here. Then we're gonna create a new layer. We're gonna grab these two, group them, and call them background. We select that new layer, filter, vanishing point. Now to lay out the vanishing point, I'm going to use the help of this slab here to do that. I'm going to click these 4 points and I'll zoom in and make sure that I got these right where they have to be. Now I can grab this plane that I made and grab these points and extend it all the way through. Then I'm going to Control V, bring that image in, place it on my plane. And then using Control, I can just copy the same layer and move it around to create the effect that it's a ground plane that I've made. Once you're done, you press OK. We could turn off this layer. And that's our ground plane basically. Now we're gonna grab this ground that we made. We're gonna duplicate it. I'm gonna call it foreground. We're gonna move it to the front and place it in a group called foreground. I'm gonna turn down the opacity on that a little bit. And now I'm gonna grab this lasso tool, make a little outline where I wanna get rid of that foreground. So now I've made an outline of what I wanna keep. And let me just turn the opacity on. And I'm gonna mask that. So this is the before and this is after. And so we can go in with our eraser and bring down the scale, make sure it's a hard round brush, and the opacity, we could bring it all the way up. And so what we can do now is we can grab our paintbrush, make sure we select a hard round brush, and the opacity, bring it to 100. And then we want to switch this over to white. Now we can manually remove some of that to create the effect that it's the ground layer that's actually natural. So now we have our basic ground, and now we want to make the sky. So we're going to group these. We're going to call this the ground. Now I'm going to make a new folder within the background and I'm going to call that sky. And I could re-import that layer that I've already made. Make sure that the group is underground. And now we can move this to make it look like a sky. Now I'm going to grab this and I'm going to duplicate it. And I'm going to go to Edit, Transform, Flip Horizontal, and I can move this to the other side. And there I have my sky. So I'm going to grab these two. I'm going to convert to a smart object. I'm going to add an adjustment layer for brightness. I'm going to bring this up, and that's okay for now. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new layer, and we're going to start adding the glass to this building. And again, we have to go to Filter, Vanishing Point, and now we're going to create a new vanishing point for this area here. Now once you have that plane made, this is actually a cool trick. You can click this arrow here, and then holding the Control key, it starts to create the next plane for you. And this isn't perfect, but it's better than having to draw everything. So what we'll do is we'll extend that all the way to the end, and then we can manually adjust these points. And so with those two made, now we can Control V to bring our material in, and we're going to bring down the scale a bit. Because since we're only going to be using one material, we have to make sure we differentiate every single plane using as many tricks as we can, including scale and shadows and perspective. Pretty much anything we can come up with. And so what I've done is that I've created the illusion of mullions by stamping a bunch of these on top of each other, but at different points. So I'll move it around and I'll stamp it above so you can see this harsh line, and we'll press OK. And again, we want to make sure that we pick up some of the shadows that we brought in from Rhino. So we'll grab this glazing layer and we'll change it to multiply. And now you can see some of the shadows beneath it start to pop out, and it gives it a really cool 3-dimensional effect. Next, we're going to tackle this volume, this core here, and it's going to be the same thing. You create a new layer and then you go to Filter, Vanishing Point. That's pretty much what we're going to be doing for the rest of this video with some minor changes. Control V brings in the material again. And now here, when we Control T to change its size, we want to make sure and we make this look a little bit more vertical. We'll press OK, and we'll switch this to multiply as well. Now you'll notice that we can see what's happening below, and that's because when we set this layer of glazing to multiply, what it does is that it becomes semi-transparent, and so now we can see this glass volume below. And we're not going to do anything about that because this is glazing, so we actually do want to see some sort of transparency behind it. And we're gonna adjust that after we're done. We're gonna do something to make it not so transparent, but just keep that in mind, because as we move on to some of these other materials that we don't want to see what's behind, we're gonna have to tackle it differently. So next we're gonna tackle these edges here, these slabs. And if you are wondering why this slab looks like this, it's a design element, but it's also functional. The reason is when it rains, the water will fall down, and you would think that it would hit the glass and the glass will get dirty, but when you do a detail like this, you want to have something called the drip edge, and it would be just a line, a score that goes on the concrete or whatever this is, metal, whatever it's going to be. And when the water hits that line, it accumulates there and then it drips down, and then it falls on this slab here and it continues to run off. It's a way of trying to mitigate water collection on this slab down here. So by now you guys know the drill. We're gonna make this more slender. Control V, Control T, bring this down, make it nice and slender. Sometimes it has a hard time trying to fit into a specific place. So I don't fully understand why Photoshop does that. But what I try to do is I'll change the scale a little bit and then I'll try a few times. There, I finally got it to get on there, but for some reason it just didn't want to work properly, so I had to scale it a weird way. So what I'll do is I'll grab this material. I'll try to get it as close to the edge as possible. And then now we can see some of those control handles on it, and we can control it there. And we'll scale it down. All right, there we go. Now we're gonna, of course, switch this to multiply. And so now we have that condition that I was talking to you guys about, where we have this slab where we're now seeing the core behind it, and we don't want that to happen. And how we fix that is we simply select it using the magic wand tool, and we go back to our core layer and we mask that region. Next, we're gonna do this slab here at the bottom. Now we're gonna do the same thing we did before, which is grab this magic wand tool, select the slab, go to the core, select the mask layer, invert the layer, and then using the paint bucket tool. All right, so next we're gonna do these edges here. So that's one, the second one is this one, and that's two. I'm gonna use the paint bucket tool to make those two gray. I'm gonna bring this old layer that we had, duplicate it using, I'm holding the Alt button and then moving that layer up, and that duplicates it. Now we can go back and turn this one off. And then what we do is we right click on this and clip it to that layer that we created. And you see it adds it here, and you can't even tell. It's so, that detail is so small that we can't even see the vanishing point on it. And what we could do is just to create a little bit of a differentiation, we can make the scale really small. Let's bring this close in, and then holding the Alt button, we just copy that over a couple times, and that duplicates the layer. And then what we do now is we grab all of these three, turn it into a smart object, and then we want to move this down to multiply. I've made a new layer called ground area, and let's go work on that vanishing point. So let's start with this one here. I'm gonna extend it just a little bit outside, make sure everything lines up. All right, so now I have that area made. Control V brings in this material, Control T. All right, that's one. Now below that layer, I'm gonna create a new layer to create this part here. That's perfect. Now it looks like we may have messed it up, right? But we haven't, because first of all, we have to turn this layer on to multiply, and next we have to do the same for the other one. And then once we have those two made, what we have to do is temporarily hide these two, and we're gonna create a mask for this whole area. So now we could turn those back on, select each one, and click to mask. So we've masked the first one. Now we just simply right click on that. We click where it says add to mask selection, click the next one, and do the same thing. I took a little break to have some Cuban cafecito. So now we can continue doing this. All right, so I missed a little area. It's not a big deal. That's the good thing about masking. We can just select this portion here, do this to it, and we can paint that white. All right, now we simply have to select this portion of the core here and mask that as well. But see, you have to be careful how you do this, because now we have to select this part, because that shouldn't be on the core. And we want to make sure that on that new area that we made, this layer here, we want to mask that. But we did too much, not good. Perfect. How's that looking? Bring it in a little bit closer. And we want to make sure that we don't make the scale too big on this one, so that it doesn't compete with the ground. See, we've lost it, but it's okay, because now what we can do is, of course, as you already know, is make it a multiply layer and start masking it so that we don't lose it. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is, remember this foreground layer that I made here, this one? We're going to select that. So I'm going to right click, and I'm going to add mask to the selection. Then I'm going to go back to the driveway, turn it on, invert the layer, that's Control Shift I, and mask it. Then I'll select the driveway's mask, and using the paint bucket tool with black, I'll click outside, and that's gonna get rid of everything that we don't need. Now you could kind of see it, but not quite. So we're gonna have to go to our ground layer, select it, add an adjustment layer. We could do the brightness and contrast. We'll bring the brightness down. Let's do -50. And we can duplicate this layer, and we could copy that over above the foreground. And we'll click this to make sure we clip it on, and the same for the one that's below. I think we can make it a little bit darker. Let's try 80. Same for the one above. And for the driveway, we'll add an adjustment layer and we'll bring the brightness up. Make sure to clip it on, not too much. Next, we'll move on to the stairs. Extend the plane out a little bit. We made a nice little patch there, and we'll press OK. Turn on the multiply, temporarily turn it off, and we can start making the profile of the stairs with the lasso tool. Now we could turn this layer back on, invert the selection, and mask it. We can also go back and remove this part from the other layer. And then finally, we're going to add this part here. That's one layer. We'll turn it off, and then we'll make another layer and use the next plane. Move this out of the way, bring one of these over here, Control V, scale it, press OK. And now we have these two layers, and we can start masking them separately. So let's start with this one, multiply. We can grab this mask that we already made, add mask to selection, and we can mask that from this one here. First we Control Shift I to invert the selection, and then we mask it. And then using the polygonal lasso tool, we can remove some of the extra stuff out of the way. So use the paint bucket tool, mask it out. And actually we didn't even need this layer, so we can just delete it because it doesn't look bad the way that it is. And we're almost done here. We just got to add some more details, but overall it's looking very impressive. We'll select this whole area, and then we'll invert that whole area. And under select, modify, smooth, we'll smooth it up, let's say by 75 pixels. And you see now it makes it all nice and smooth. And then we can start to follow that contour, getting closer in just like that. Same thing. Once we have that drawn, we select it, modify it smooth, same smooth level. We'll invert that selection, and again, we'll go over a little here. Now what we're gonna do, that looks pretty cool. Now what we're gonna do is select the filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and we're gonna select a nice number here that where we don't lose totally what we did, but we don't see these edges anymore. So actually I think 5 is good. We can do 5, and then we want to bring this opacity down, let's say 75. Oh, I went too high up there, but just so that we can start to see that contrast a little better. And this shadow here, we can make a Gaussian blur. Let's make it 5 as well. So that's before and that's after. It looks like nothing happened. And then we can try turning down the opacity a little bit. So let's try for 90 on here. And let's make a new shadow layer, and we're gonna add some contour to this part here. And we have to, of course, clip it. So what I was saying about this cube, I want you to think about something. This is glass, right? This is some glazing here. And so this material that's behind it, it won't show up this dark. And even if it did, this part here definitely won't be as dark because it's further away. And also it won't be, since it's a frosted glazing, it won't be as perfect, these lines. So we have to do two things to that portion. So we're gonna select our brush, and we're gonna start to blend some of that in. Make sure you select the layer, and then we're gonna go to filter, blur, motion blur, and we're gonna blur it like that. And so that's what it looks like. Now it looks like it's a reflection within that. So now this begins to look glossy. And then finally here, let's add some trees. So how are we gonna add some trees? Well, I could cheat and I could bring in a tree and then mask it with the copper, just as I've done everything else. But since I only want to make this one single image, beside the sketch, of course, just the copper is the only image I'm going to be using, then I'm going to have to recreate these trees. And for A, we're just going to try and draw the canopy of a tree. I think that's too harsh. There, that's our canopy. And then now we're going to draw the rest of it. How do you like my tree? I think we can make this skinnier. Let's warp it a bit. Transform, warp. All right, great. Now we bring the copper material above it and clip it to the tree. Make it brighter, clip it on. I think that's too bright. And of course we need shadows on the tree, so we're gonna create a new layer, call it shadow. Right click, create clipping mask, and then we're gonna paint it on, but we're gonna select a different type of brush. And for this one, I'm gonna use Kyle Bonus Chunky Charcoal. I've used this one before, it's fun to say. I'm gonna bring down the scale a bit. Let's say 80. I think 80 is good. And the opacity, we're gonna bring it down to maybe 20. and then we're gonna bring the color to black. And so what I'm gonna start to do is spec some of this on. Bring the transparency down a little bit. There you go, and there's our tree. You didn't have faith in me, huh? You saw that weird gray looking thing and you're like, oh man, he just messed this whole thing up. But no, looks nice. Check that out. And this one's in front so we can make it bigger. Oh, but it gets better. So we can open this up and grab this layer here and move it around so that it has a different texture to it. Now we gotta create a shadow layer and we'll put that below the trees. And again, using that same brush that we used before, the Kyle's Chunky Charcoal, we wanna make sure the opacity is set down, make it larger, and start to go under some of those areas. Now we really want this glass to stand out, so we're pretty much done here. It's just the finishing touches that we're just adding at this point, and the more you look at it, the more you're like, you know, I should do this, I should do that, so on and so forth. But in this case, there's really not much else we can do except to add to this part, make it brighter so it stands out more, it looks like glass. So we grab this glazing layer, we click it, we add an adjustment layer, we want to click the brightness and contrast, make sure we clip it on, then we make that match somewhat the sky, and we could give it a nice contrast. All right guys, and there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this exercise, and I hope you guys try to do something like this for yourselves because it's really fun and a really rewarding experience, and it's something that looks great in our portfolios. If you're wondering how you can get a copy of this artwork here and you want to try and support the channel, then head over to my description and I'll have the details there. Thanks for watching. I'm Mooch and this is Pigeonhead Architecture. See you down in the comments.